The Wyoming winter of 1885 was unforgiving, the kind that could kill a man in minutes if he wasn't careful. Jake Morrison had been careful his whole life, but 36 years of careful living couldn't protect him from the fever that had been burning through his body for the past 2 days. His horse, a reliable Mustang named Dusty, had finally given up beneath him 3 miles back, collapsing in the deep snow with labored breathing that told Jake the animal wouldn't be getting up again. He'd taken his rifle, his saddlebags, and what little food he had left, then started walking toward the settlement of Pine Ridge, still 15 miles away through the mountain pass. Now, as the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks and the temperature dropped even further, Jake felt his legs give out. He stumbled forward, caught himself against a snow-covered pine, then fell to his knees. The fever made everything seem distant and unreal, like he was watching someone else's life through thick glass. His breath came in ragged gasps, creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Jake had survived cattle drives, Indian raids, and bar fights, but he'd never felt death this close before. It sat on his shoulder like a patient vulture, waiting for him to stop fighting. Should have stayed in Cheyenne, he muttered through chattering teeth. Should have waited for the fever to break. But Jake had never been good at waiting. When word came that his brother Tom was sick in Pine Ridge, Jake had saddled up despite his own illness. Family meant everything in this harsh country, and Tom was the only family he had left. The snow began falling again, thick flakes that stuck to his coat and hat. Jake tried to stand but couldn't find the strength. His vision blurred, and he felt himself falling sideways into the snowbank. The cold felt almost warm against his fevered skin. As consciousness faded, Jake heard something that made no sense. Footsteps, small ones crunching through the snow toward him. He forced his eyes open and saw a tiny figure approaching through the swirling snow. It was a child, a little girl maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing a coat that was too big for her and boots that looked like they'd been patched many times. Her dark hair was braided and mostly hidden under a knitted cap, and her small face was serious beyond her years. "Mister," she said, kneeling beside him in the snow. "Mister, you can't sleep here. You'll freeze." Jake tried to speak, but only managed a weak groan. The girl looked around frantically, then began tugging at his arm with surprising determination. "Come on, mister. My shelter ain't far. You gotta help me help you." Jake didn't understand how this child could be out here alone in the wilderness, but her voice cut through the fever fog in his mind. He managed to get to his hands and knees, then with the girl's help, struggled to his feet. "That's it," she encouraged. "Just a little ways more." The girl led him through the trees to what looked like an abandoned mining shack, its roof partially collapsed, but still offering protection from the wind and snow. She'd clearly been living there for some time. A small fire burned in a makeshift stone circle, and Jake could see blankets arranged in one corner, along with a few canned goods and a dented pot. Jake collapsed as soon as they were inside, his body giving up the last of its strength. The girl immediately went to work, adding wood to the fire and dragging one of her blankets over to cover him. "You're real sick," she said matter-of-factly, placing a small hand on his forehead. "But don't worry. I know how to take care of sick folks. I took care of my mama before she died." Through his delirium, Jake felt the weight of the blanket and the warmth of the fire. This tiny girl, who should have been home safe with her family, was instead saving the life of a stranger in the middle of nowhere. As the fever pulled him under, Jake's last coherent thought was wondering who was going to save her. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness for what felt like days. Sometimes he was aware of the little girl moving around the shack, tending the fire or trying to get water down his throat. Other times he was lost in fevered dreams of cattle drives and gunfights, calling out names of people long dead. During his clear moments, he learned that the girl's name was Sarah, and she'd been living in the abandoned shack for over a month. Her mother had died of consumption, and with no other family, Sarah had run away from the orphanage in a town called Millerville. "They weren't mean to me," Sarah explained as she spooned thin soup into Jake's mouth. "But there were too many kids and not enough food. I figured I could take care of myself better than they could take care of me." Jake wanted to tell her that a 6-year-old girl couldn't survive alone in the wilderness, but the evidence was right in front of him. Not only had Sarah survived, she was now keeping him alive, too. The girl had remarkable survival instincts. She learned to set snares for rabbits and knew which plants were safe to eat. She kept the fire going constantly, carefully rationing the wood she'd gathered. Most impressively, she seemed to understand that Jake needed more than just food and warmth to recover. My mama used to say that sometimes people die because they give up hope. Sarah told him on the third day, as she helped him sit up to drink some pine needle tea she brewed. She said you gotta keep fighting even when everything seems hopeless. Jake studied the girl's face in the firelight. Despite everything she'd been through, there was a strength in her eyes that reminded him of his own mother. Sarah had every reason to give up, but instead she'd chosen to fight, not just for herself, but for him too. "Why are you helping me?" Jake asked, his voice still weak but clearer than it had been. Sarah considered the question seriously. "Because that's what people do," she said finally. "They help each other. My mama taught me that." Over the following days, as Jake's fever broke and his strength slowly returned, he learned more about Sarah's remarkable journey. She'd walked nearly 100 miles from Millerville, avoiding main roads and towns, living off what she could forage and catch. She'd found a mining shack by accident and decided it was a good place to wait out the winter. "I was planning to head south come spring," she explained. "Find someplace warm where I could work for food and a place to sleep." Jake felt a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. This little girl had more courage and resourcefulness than most grown men he knew, but she was still just a child who needed protection and guidance. "What about your pa?" Jake asked gently. Sarah's expression grew sad. "Never knew him. Mama said he was a good man who died in the war before I was born. She kept his picture, but it got lost when we had to leave our house." As Jake's health improved, he began helping Sarah with the daily tasks of survival. He showed her how to make better snares and how to read the weather signs in the sky. In return, she taught him about the medicinal plants her mother had shown her and how to make a fire that would burn all night with minimal wood. They developed an easy partnership, each contributing their skills to their shared survival. Jake found himself looking forward to their conversations by the fire in the evenings, when Sarah would tell him stories her mother had shared or ask him about his life as a cowboy. "You got any kids of your own?" Sarah asked one night. Jake shook his head. "Never stayed in one place long enough to have a family. Been drifting most of my life." "That sounds lonely," Sarah said with the direct honesty that only children possess. Jake realized she was right. He had been lonely, though he'd never admitted it to himself. But sitting in this ramshackle shelter with this brave little girl, he felt less alone than he had in years. "Sometimes the best things in life find you when you're not looking for them," Jake said, surprising himself with the admission. Sarah smiled, the first truly carefree smile he'd seen from her. "Like how I found you in the snow." "Like how you found me in the snow," Jake agreed. A week into his recovery, Jake was strong enough to venture outside the shack. The snow had stopped falling, and the world was painted in brilliant white under a clear blue sky. Sarah showed him around her small domain, pointing out the creek where she got water, the deadfall where she gathered firewood, and the meadow where she'd successfully snared 3 rabbits. "You've done remarkable work here," Jake told her honestly. "Most grown folks wouldn't have managed half as well." Sarah beamed with pride, but then her expression grew serious. "Jake, what's going to happen when you're all better? You're going to leave me here?" The question cut straight to Jake's heart. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it was coming but not sure how to handle it. The truth was, he couldn't leave Sarah alone in the wilderness, but he also couldn't stay here forever. His brother Tom was still sick in Pine Ridge, and Jake had responsibilities. "I won't leave you alone," Jake promised. "But we need to think about what's best for you long term. You can't spend your whole life hiding in the mountains." "But I don't want to go back to an orphanage," Sarah said, her voice small and frightened. "Please don't make me go back there." Jake knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Listen to me, Sarah. I give you my word that I won't let anyone put you someplace where you're not wanted or cared for properly. But you need to be somewhere safe, somewhere you can go to school and have friends your own age." "What if I came with you?" Sarah asked hopefully. "I could help you with your work. I'm good at taking care of things." Jake's throat tightened with emotion. In just a week, this little girl had become more important to him than he thought possible. The idea of taking her with him was tempting, but he knew it wasn't practical. A cowboy's life was hard and dangerous, no place for a child. "Tell me about your brother," Sarah said, changing the subject when she saw Jake's troubled expression. Jake was grateful for the distraction. He told Sarah about Tom, how they'd grown up together after their parents died, how Tom had always been the responsible one while Jake was the wanderer. Tom had settled in Pine Ridge 2 years ago, married a nice woman named Catherine, and was trying to build a respectable life. Maybe he needs someone to help take care of him while he's sick, Sarah suggested with the hopeful tone of a child trying to solve an adult problem. Maybe he does, Jake said thoughtfully. That evening, as they shared a dinner of rabbit stew and wild onions, Jake made a decision that surprised even him. Sarah, how would you feel about coming to Pine Ridge with me? Just to visit at first to meet my brother and his wife. If you don't like it there, we'll figure out something else. Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement, then grew cautious. You really mean it? You're not just saying that. I mean it, Jake said firmly. We're partners now. Partners don't abandon each other. Sarah threw her arms around Jake's neck, hugging him tighter than he'd ever been hugged in his life. Thank you, Jake. Thank you for not leaving me. Jake hugged her back, feeling something shift inside his chest. For the first time in his adult life, he understood what it meant to have someone depend on him completely and, more surprisingly, to want that responsibility. The next morning, Jake began preparations for the journey to Pine Ridge. His fever was completely gone, and his strength had returned. Sarah helped him gather supplies and plan their route, showing the same practical intelligence that had kept her alive alone in the wilderness. We'll travel slow and careful, Jake explained. It's still 15 miles through rough country, and we can't take any chances with you along. I can keep up, Sarah said with quiet confidence. I walked 100 miles to get here, remember? Jake smiled. I remember, but this time you won't be walking alone. As they prepared to leave the little shack that had sheltered them both, Jake realized that Sarah had saved more than just his life. She'd saved something in his soul that he thought was lost forever. The drifting cowboy who collapsed in the snow was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood what it meant to have something worth fighting for. The journey to Pine Ridge took 2 days, with Jake setting a careful pace to accommodate Sarah's shorter legs. They made good time through the mountain passes, now familiar to Jake from his fevered trek in the opposite direction. Sarah proved to be an excellent traveling companion, never complaining about the cold or the difficult terrain. On the morning of the second day, they crested a hill and saw Pine Ridge spread out in the valley below. It was a small but thriving settlement, built around a lumber mill, and supported by the surrounding ranches. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and Jake could see people moving about their daily business in the streets. It's bigger than Millerville, Sarah observed, clutching Jake's hand a little tighter. Don't worry, Jake assured her. My brother Tom is good people. So is his wife Catherine. They'll make you feel welcome. They found Tom's house on the outskirts of town, a modest but well-built structure with a small barn and corral. Jake's heart lifted when he saw smoke coming from the chimney and Tom's horse in the corral, signs that his brother was recovering from his illness. Tom Morrison was 4 years older than Jake, with the same dark hair and blue eyes but a more settled demeanor. When he opened the door and saw Jake standing there with Sarah, his face broke into a grin of pure joy. Jake, we got word that you'd started from Cheyenne, but when you didn't arrive, we feared the worst. The winter's been brutal. Tom's gaze moved to Sarah, taking in her serious expression and the way she stayed close to Jake's side. And who's this young lady? This is Sarah, Jake said, resting a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. She saved my life when I collapsed in the snow up in the mountains. Sarah, this is my brother Tom. Tom knelt down to Sarah's level just as Jake had learned to do. Well, Sarah, any friend of Jake's is family to us. Thank you for taking care of my stubborn brother. Sarah smiled shyly. He took care of me too. We're partners. Catherine Morrison appeared in the doorway, a kind-faced woman in her early 30s with blonde hair and gentle eyes. When she saw Sarah, her maternal instincts immediately kicked in. Oh, my goodness, you poor dear. Come inside right now before you catch your death of cold. I've got hot soup on the stove and fresh bread just out of the oven. Over. The next hour, as they warmed themselves by Tom and Catherine's fire and shared a proper meal, Jake told the story of how Sarah had found him and nursed him back to health. He was careful to emphasize the girl's courage and resourcefulness, wanting his brother and sister-in-law to see her as he did. Catherine was particularly moved by Sarah's story. You've been through so much for someone so young, she said, smoothing Sarah's hair. But you're safe now? Jake said I could stay with you for a visit, Sarah said carefully. If you don't mind, that is. Tom and Catherine exchanged a meaningful look. Of course you can stay, Catherine said warmly. For as long as you'd like. Later, after Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch wrapped in one of Catherine's quilts, the three adults sat around the kitchen table talking in low voices. She's been through hell, Jake said quietly. But she's the strongest person I've ever met. She deserves a real chance at life. What are your plans? Tom asked. I know you, Jake. You're not the settling type. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. I've been thinking about that. Maybe it's time I stopped running from responsibility. That little girl needs stability, and she trusts me. Catherine leaned forward. Jake, Tom and I have been talking about children. We want a family, but... She paused, glancing at her husband. Well, the doctor says it might not happen for us naturally. If Sarah needs a home, and if you think she'd be happy here, we'd love to have her become part of our family. Jake felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. She'd need to make that choice herself. But I think she'd like that. She needs parents who appreciate how special she is. What about you? Tom asked. Will you stay in Pine Ridge? Jake looked toward the living room where Sarah slept peacefully, probably the first truly safe sleep she'd had in months. I think I might. There's good ranch land around here, and I've got some money saved. Maybe it's time I put down roots. 3 months later, Jake stood in the Pine Ridge church watching Sarah, now legally Sarah Morrison, as she helped Catherine arrange flowers for the Sunday service. The adoption papers had been finalized the week before, and Sarah had bloomed in the secure environment of Tom and Catherine's home. Jake had bought a small ranch just outside of town, close enough to visit Sarah regularly, but far enough to give the new family space to grow together. He discovered that he enjoyed the steady work of building something permanent, and the townspeople had welcomed him as Tom's brother and Sarah's guardian angel. She looks happy, Tom said, joining Jake at the back of the church. She is happy, Jake replied. We all are. Sarah looked up from her flower arranging and waved at Jake with a bright smile. In that moment, Jake understood that sometimes the most important journeys weren't the ones that took you far from home, but the ones that finally brought you home. The cowboy who had collapsed in the snow had been saved by a tiny orphan girl's blanket and stubborn refusal to let him die. But in the end, they saved each other, creating a family bound not by blood, but by the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of survival and love. Synapse no rigoroso inverno de Wyoming M. 1885. Jake Morrison. Cowboy solitario de 36 años. Colapsa no nieve en cuanto via Java febro atrives das montañas per visitor su ermeo dana Pine Ridge. Cuando esta presa se cambia a frío ergoinca, uma pequeña orfa da 6 años sema, Sarah aperis natem pista de nieve. A pesar de su tenra edad, Sarah tem vivido sozinha nas montañas há mais de mês, sobreviviendo com habilidades que aprende cuidando de sua memória abundante de fugir de orfanato superlotado. Sarah se dirige para abrigo improvisado em uma cabana de miracá abandonada, onde ela o envolve em seu próprio cobertor e se recusa de lo morrer. Durante uma semana, essa menina extraordinária cuida de Jake com a sabedoria e determinação é algo muito mais velha, preparando remédios caseiros, mantendo o fogo aceso e forcando, ou a lutar contra a febre que parecia matá-lo. Enquanto Jake se recupera, ele descobre que Sarah é uma sobrevivente notável que caminha sem milhas sozinha através do território selvagem. Conforme os dois desenvolvem vínculo profundo baizer, com a confiança mútua na necessidade de sobrevivência, Jake enfrenta uma decisão difícil sobre o futuro de Sarah. Ela não pode dedicar-se sozinha nas montanhas, mas também não pode forcar lá voltar para o orfanato que ela tanto teme. A Saluco vem quando Jake decide levá-la para conhecer seu irmão Tom e sua esposa Catherine M. Pine Ridge, na esperança de que eles possam oferecer a menina a família estável que ela merece. A jornada Pine Ridge torna sua oportunidade para Jake e Sarah solidificaram sua parceria única. Quando chegamos à cidade, Tom e Catherine Morrison imediatamente se encantam com Sarah e oferecem a todo lá oficialmente. A história culmina 3 meses depois, com zero legalidade se tornando parte da família Morrison, enquanto Jake compra rancho próximo, finalmente encontrando as raízes que havia afetado toda sua vida. O cowboy solitário que quis moro na neve descobriu que às vezes as jornadas mais importantes são aquelas que nos levam para casa, e que família não é definida apenas por sangue, mas pelos laços inquebráveis forjados através de sacrifício, coragem e amor incondicional.